America's top cybersecurity official has said the Trump administration has not given up on its fight to stop the UK using Huawei technology in its 5G networks. During a visit to Europe this week, Robert Strayer, the US Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber and Communications, said he did not believe the government's decision to give the Chinese firm limited access was final. So who is right when it comes to security, and why don't the Americans have an equivalent telecoms giant leading the way on 5G? Well, Emily Taylor is the Chief Executive Officer of Oxford Information Labs and an Associate Fellow at Chatham House. And in our London studio is Jamal Ahmed, founder of Casient Privacy Experts and a Fellow of Information Privacy. Emily, there is a bit of an elephant in the room here, isn't there? Which is, how have we got to a situation where the United States, of all countries, appears not to have the technology for the next generation of mobile telecoms?
Yes, we're used to the US being the dominant force in technology. And I think that really, your question goes to the heart of this issue. There aren't very many competitors for 5G infrastructure, and none of them are from the United States. Now, I think this is causing an awful lot of angst in the US. Some people are calling for, let's just forget about 5G and go straight on, put everything into 6G. But that's quite a risky strategy. And so it's one of those classic cases where, you really wouldn't have designed it like this if you'd known in advance. But this is the way the market has played out into a very, very, consolidated market with very little competition.
Yes, Jamal, given that I guess most computing now is done on mobile devices as a percentage, certainly outside the office. It seems extraordinary that America, of all countries, is not in the lead on this.
Yes, I mean, it is quite extraordinary that America isn't on the lead on this. But what we can see over the last 20, 30 years is America actually been focusing a lot more on developing software than hardware, whereas countries such as China have been really quite efficient and effective when it comes to hardware. And I think the Americans, one of the other things is when we're talking about 5G and you look at kind of spectrums that it needs to be transmitted on, in most countries in the world, the government allows that low-band spectrum to be used for commercial purposes. Now, if you take a country such as America, they actually reserve that for the military. So there is no motivation or there is no drive for any commercial companies in the United States to try and tap into that. And 5G uses low-band because the signals can travel further. Using the low spectrum. So if there's no businesses that can use that low spectrum, there's no need for them to develop or build any 5G capabilities or any transmitting capabilities. And I think that's probably why there is no 5G competitor such as Huawei, Ericsson or Nokia coming out of the United States.
Emily, what can the Americans do, if anything? You talked about how there was talk of skipping 5G. I mean, there was another idea, I think it was William Barr, the Attorney General, who floated it, that America could somehow or other take controlling stakes in Nokia and Ericsson, the companies Jamal's just mentioned there. That was shot down. Is there any way they can get American companies perhaps making some of this bandwidth available and catch up with Huawei?
So there's two issues. There's the spectrum bandwidth issues that Jamal's been talking about. But I think another idea that has been put forward, and it's more than an idea, actually actively, Vodafone in the United Kingdom is investing in startups that are offering open source interoperable 5G equipment, and that would prevent the sort of supplier lock-in that we see. And it could, if you use open protocols such as Open RAN, as it's called, then there's a possibility to really disrupt this market. And both in the US and UK, we're seeing active investment in new startups. And so that's not going to be ready right now, although field tests have been done with these technologies and with these companies. But in the medium term, that could well be part of the solution.
Now, Jamal, this whole argument about Huawei, the American government insists that even having its equipment on the periphery of a 5G network means it's open to risk. Huawei, of course, insists that they have never been agents of the Chinese state, are not at the moment, and never will be. But just from a technical point of view, is there any way you can have Huawei equipment as part of, say, the UK's 5G system and not have a risk of, I don't know, spying, interference, that sort of thing?
So we need to consider a couple of things. So the first thing we need to look at is what is it that Huawei actually does, or what do they have access to? So they provide all of the equipment, or some of the equipment, that will be used to transmit that data. Now, what countries such as the US, Australia, New Zealand, and increasingly the public in the UK are worried about is what happens when this data is transmitted. So Huawei is a Chinese company, and in China they have a law that says that if China asks any company or any person or organization in there for data, they have to submit that and pass that over to the government. And this is what everyone's concerned about, is at any point the Chinese government could ask Huawei to start sharing that data with them or transmitting that data to them. And that's where they're worried about the international espionage. Now, what Huawei say is there's no evidence of us ever doing that. We've never done that in the past. And even then, you've got the NCSC, the National Cyber Security Centre in the UK, that says the UK has one of the most toughest and rigorous oversight regimes in the world, saying they're quite comfortable that we can mitigate against any such risks that might happen. And the thing is, if Huawei was to start submitting that data to Chinese government, then we would be aware of that very quickly and we could do something about it straight away. So it'd be like a one-off incident. The other issue is what Huawei say, the American executives actually said, it's actually cheaper for them to try and bribe telecom officials than it is for them to try and, spy on that data that's being submitted through their antennas.
Well, that is, yes, an unorthodox argument. Emily, are you as happy for Huawei to be involved in the UK network?
It's not really a question of being happy or not. 5G is going to build on existing 4G infrastructure. Huawei is already deeply embedded in 4G in this country, so there's not an awful lot of choice unless you start ripping up existing core networks in this country. I think one of the things I struggle with is a false comparison to say, one supplier is more secure, another supplier is not secure. What we see again and again with cyber attacks is, one, you don't have to be the provider of that network in order to compromise it. One of the actually scariest things
but what
about
Huawei...
the
point Jamal made was that there is this law in China which enables the Chinese state to require data transmitted over networks of any Chinese company.
Yes, we have similar laws in this country. Of course, the human rights regime in China is very different to what it is in the EU or the UK. However, Huawei has said, just for the record, that it would resist such a move and that it hasn't been asked to date. But I think the question is, you can over-focus on Huawei as the provider of the network and what it could do. These are plausible security concerns, but there are many other security concerns relating to 5G. The sort of insecure devices that will be attached to the network, the software core of the network, and what Huawei has very buggy software, and that is a real security risk.
Jamal, you explained in some detail earlier the particular reasons that the Americans lagged behind in 5G technology. But are there other areas where China, or indeed any other countries, have a lead over the Americans?
I think this all comes back to the reasons why Trump is trying to prevent other countries from using Huawei. Is what he can see is that the Americans are quite behind when it comes to innovation in this kind of area. But actually, if you look at software, that's where you can see that America is actually ahead. You've got some of the biggest software tech companies coming out of America. So you've got companies like Amazon, Google, etc. And you can see that they've been focusing on them since the success of Microsoft back in the early 90s.
Right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed, Jamal Ahmed and Emily Taylor.
And finally from us today, Nelson Mandela called them South Africa's cultural...